Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. It happened on one of those cloudy Thursdays that felt heavier than they should. The kind of day where the air sits still, as if it's waiting for something to happen. I was at work, sipping lukewarm coffee, pretending to read an email for the third time, when my boss, Mr. Anderson, knocked lightly on the frame of my open office door. He wasn't the kind of man who knocked often. Usually, he just walked in, said what he needed, and left before I even had the chance to respond. But that day, he hesitated. That's how I knew something was different. "Can I steal you for a few minutes?" he asked. His tone was polite, softer than usual. I nodded, half expecting it to be about another project or the quarterly report. I followed him down the hallway, past the row of glass offices that reflected the grey light from outside. The rain had just started, soft, slow drops tapping against the windows. We stopped by the small meeting room at the end of the hall, the one no one ever used because the heater made a constant humming sound. He opened the door, motioned for me to come in, and closed it behind us. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood near the window, looking out at the parking lot below. His reflection against the glass looked almost thoughtful, maybe even tired. I'd worked for him for over 10 years, and I'd seen him in every mood imaginable: frustrated, focused, occasionally kind, but never like this. "I wanted to ask you something," he said finally, turning toward me. "Something a little different." That sentence alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. People always say curiosity is harmless, but in moments like that, it feels like standing on the edge of something uncertain. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, please." I did. The hum of the heater filled the silence as he sat down too, folding his hands together. "You've been here longer than most," he began. "You've seen this company change, seen me change. You've carried a lot of weight, often without anyone noticing." I wasn't sure how to respond. Praise wasn't something that came often from him. "I've been thinking," he continued. "What do you really want from all of this? From your work, from me, from life, maybe?" I blinked. It wasn't the question I was expecting. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. "Excuse me?" I asked, smiling awkwardly. "Are we still talking about my performance review?" He smiled too, but faintly. "No. Not this time." Something about his tone disarmed me. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a trap. It was genuine. That alone felt strange enough to make me nervous. "I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before," I said quietly. "Then I'm glad I did," he replied. "Because I think you've forgotten to ask yourself that too." His words lingered between us, like smoke that refuses to fade. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had typed countless reports, brewed endless cups of coffee, and built a quiet, invisible life. What did I want? 4 years, I'd convinced myself it was security, routine, predictability. I had told myself that staying steady meant staying safe. But now, sitting there in that small, humming room, I realized I didn't even know what that meant anymore. "I used to know," I said finally. "Or I thought I did." He nodded, as if he understood more than I expected him to. "When I started this company," he said, "I thought success would make everything clearer. But lately, I've been wondering if it only makes things quieter and lonelier." There was something human in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not the confident tone of a man who always had answers, but the weary honesty of someone who'd started to question the cost of those answers. The rain outside grew heavier, and for a while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was still. Like both of us were waiting for the right words to arrive on their own. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. "Leaving? The job. The routines. The versions of ourselves we built to survive." I hesitated. "Every now and then. But then I remind myself, this is all I know." He leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "Maybe that's the problem." I looked up at him, trying to read the expression in his eyes. It wasn't judgmental. It was reflective, almost searching. Like he wasn't just asking me, he was asking himself too. For the first time, I saw him not as my boss, but as a person. Someone who carried his own invisible weight. The moment stretched on, filled with the steady sound of the rain and the low hum of the heater. Something about the atmosphere felt heavier, but not uncomfortable, more like an emotional mirror neither of us had planned to hold up. "I think you're right," I said quietly. "Maybe we both forgot how to want something for ourselves." He smiled again, this time, a little sad, a little grateful. "Then maybe it's time we both remembered." The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid but deeply understood. When I left that room, the hallway felt brighter somehow, though the sky was still grey. The office noise returned, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, but inside me, something had shifted. It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about rediscovery, about the quiet courage it takes to ask yourself what you truly want, even when you're afraid of the answer. That day, my boss didn't just ask me something interesting. He asked me something I hadn't dared to ask myself in years, and I knew, somehow, that this was only the beginning of a change I couldn't yet name, but could already feel. After that conversation, the days at work felt different, almost charged with a quiet energy I couldn't quite put into words. I went back to my routine, checking emails, attending meetings, juggling deadlines, but everything seemed sharper, more alive. Even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights in the office had a rhythm I hadn't noticed before. Mr. Anderson and I didn't talk about that Thursday explicitly again. He didn't bring it up, and neither did I. Yet, there was a subtle shift between us, a new layer of understanding that had been absent before. When our eyes met across the office floor, it wasn't just recognition. It was acknowledgement. A mutual respect that went beyond titles and tasks. One afternoon, a week later, he called me into the same meeting room. The rain had returned, persistent and soft, filling the space with its familiar, soothing cadence. He was already seated when I arrived, a cup of coffee in his hand, the steam curling into the air like a quiet exhale. "Good afternoon," he said lightly, his voice calm. "I hope you don't mind, I wanted to ask you something again." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Something tells me this isn't about the quarterly report." He smiled faintly. "You've got a good sense of humor today." "Yes, it's something else. Something I think you'll find interesting." I settled into the chair, feeling that same mixture of curiosity and anticipation I had felt before. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. "Have you ever thought about taking a risk that scares you?" he asked. I blinked, unsure how to answer. "Risk? Yes. Not a professional risk, necessarily. Not a promotion or a project. Something personal. Something that might challenge what you think you know about yourself." His words sank into me, unsettling in the best possible way. I realized how rarely anyone, especially someone in his position, had asked me questions that weren't directly tied to work performance. It was refreshing, terrifying, and oddly liberating all at once. I think I used to," I said slowly. "Before life got predictable." "Predictable can be safe," he said, "but it can also be limiting. It's easy to forget who we are when we stay inside the lines all the time." I nodded, absorbing his words. The quiet around us felt intentional, almost as if the room itself was giving us space to think. The rain pattered harder against the window, a gentle percussion that made everything else fade into the background. "Would you trust me if I suggested something?" he asked, looking directly at me, his eyes calm but insistent. "I think I would," I admitted. "As long as it's safe." He chuckled softly. "Always practical. I like that. But this isn't dangerous. Not in a physical sense. It's emotional. It's about exploring something new in a way that respects both of us." I felt my pulse quicken slightly. There was no awkwardness here, no hidden agenda, just a candid, human connection that felt both rare and profound. "What do you have in mind?" I asked. He hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. "I want to invite you to join me for something outside of work. A small project of the mind and heart, where we step out of our routines and see things differently. You don't have to commit to anything permanent. Just a chance to explore, to reflect, and maybe even discover something unexpected about ourselves." The honesty in his tone struck a chord. I realized that in all my years of following procedure, meeting expectations, and managing tasks, I had rarely given myself the space to just explore. To really pause, observe, and feel. "I think I'd like that," I said, almost without thinking. He nodded, a faint smile spreading across his face. "Good. That's all I wanted to hear. No pressure, no expectations. Just a conversation that could lead anywhere. The conversation ended with a quiet kind of understanding, the kind that doesn't need words to fill the room. When I left the meeting room, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp, glistening world outside. The air smelled fresh, renewed, like the beginning of something just beyond the horizon. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing small things differently, the way the sunlight hit my desk in the morning, the patterns of raindrops on the windows, even the brief exchanges with co-workers. Everything felt sharper, more vivid. It was subtle, this shift, but undeniable. Something inside me had begun to awaken, nudged forward by questions I hadn't known I needed to answer. And somewhere deep down, I felt certain that the experience Mr. Anderson had invited me toward would change more than just my perspective at work. That first week of reflection, of quiet anticipation, was only the beginning. Something unspoken, but deeply emotional, was unfolding between us, a mutual recognition of the human need to step beyond comfort zones, to explore, and perhaps, to grow together in understanding. And even though nothing tangible had happened yet, I felt a strange, thrilling certainty that my life, my routine, and my perception of myself were about to take a turn I hadn't anticipated, all because someone had asked me a question that really mattered. A few days after our initial conversation about taking emotional risks, I noticed a subtle change in the rhythm of my days. It wasn't a dramatic shift, no sudden breakthroughs or life-altering events, but rather a steady, quiet unfolding of awareness. I began to observe not just my work and routines, but the people around me, the office, even the city outside my window. Everything seemed more alive, more meaningful. Then, one morning, Mr. Anderson stopped by my desk. The office was bathed in the soft light of early autumn, the sun struggling to push through a layer of clouds. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky above remained clear. There was a casualness to his approach that I hadn't noticed before, as though the boundaries between formal and personal had blurred slightly. "Good morning," he said, smiling in that calm, deliberate way he sometimes did when he had something on his mind. "Do you have a few minutes after lunch?" I looked up from my papers, curiosity sparking. "Of course. Should I clear my schedule?" "No, just make sure you're ready for a little detour," he replied, and with a small nod, he was gone. The anticipation hung with me for the next few hours. I kept wondering what kind of detour he meant. Was it metaphorical, literal, or somewhere in between? By the time lunch rolled around, I found myself unusually eager, my thoughts looping back to that first conversation about risk and discovery. When I arrived at the small cafe where he said he would meet me, he was already there, seated at a corner table with a quiet confidence that filled the space without words. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries wrapped around me as I approached. "Good timing," he said as I sat down. I wanted to continue where we left off. But outside the office, we ordered coffee, and for a few minutes, the conversation drifted around ordinary topics: traffic, the changing weather, and a book he had recently read. Then he leaned back, eyes thoughtful, and said, "I've been thinking about what we discussed last week. About curiosity, risks, and discovering parts of ourselves we forget exist." I nodded. "It's been occupying my thoughts more than I expected." "Good," he said softly, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Because I want to show you something. Something that might help us both understand those parts of ourselves better." We left the cafe and walked through the city streets, the air crisp with early fall. The sidewalks glistened slightly from a morning drizzle, and the trees were adorned in shades of amber and gold. I felt unusually present in each step, noticing the details I would usually pass by unnoticed: the pattern of sunlight on a building, the gentle sway of a flag in the breeze, the low hum of the city moving around us. We arrived at a small art gallery tucked into a quiet street. The space was intimate, with high ceilings and walls lined with abstract paintings. Light spilled in through large windows, illuminating the room with a soft, almost ethereal glow. "I thought this might be a good place," he said, gesturing toward the artwork. "Art has a way of asking questions without demanding answers. It allows us to feel, reflect, and sometimes discover things we didn't realize were inside us." I walked slowly along the walls, taking in the colors, textures, and shapes. Each piece seemed to speak to something I had buried, something I had long ignored in my pursuit of routine and stability. He watched quietly as I moved from one painting to another, never interrupting, simply present. Finally, I stopped before a painting that seemed to shimmer under the sunlight, a cascade of blues and golds, chaotic yet balanced. It felt like it was moving, breathing, alive. I realized I was holding my breath, captivated. "What do you see?" he asked, stepping closer. I turned to him, feeling the weight of the moment. "I see possibilities," I said. "Chaos, but beautiful. Confusing, but somehow clear at the same time." He nodded, and for the first time, I saw a softness in his eyes, a depth I hadn't noticed before. "Exactly. Life isn't neat, predictable, or confined to routines. And yet, it's full of moments that can teach us more than we expect if we allow ourselves to see them." We spent hours wandering the gallery, speaking sparingly, allowing the art to guide our thoughts. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet understanding between us that transcended words. I felt a connection, not romantic, not forced, but profoundly human, a mutual recognition of the journey we were both on. As the afternoon light faded into the warm hues of early evening, we stepped back onto the streets. The city had taken on a new character in the fading light, shadows stretching long across the sidewalks, and the sky painted in delicate shades of orange and pink. "That was different," I said softly, savoring the lingering warmth of the experience. "It was meant to be," he replied, his voice calm and steady. A reminder that stepping out of familiar spaces, even briefly, can open doors inside ourselves we never knew existed. Walking back to the office, I felt lighter, yet strangely more aware of the gravity of our conversation. Something intangible had shifted between us, a bond built on curiosity, reflection, and quiet trust. I realized that these moments were more than just breaks from routine, they were invitations to explore who I really was, and who I could become if I dared to step beyond the predictable. That evening, as I returned home, I sat by the window and looked at the city lights flickering in the distance. I thought about Mr. Anderson, about the questions he asked, and the patience he had shown. For the first time in years, I felt as though someone truly saw me, not just my work, my efficiency, or my reliability, but the person behind it all. And in that quiet reflection, I realized that this was more than an afternoon outing. It was the beginning of a journey toward understanding, growth, and a deep, emotional connection that would continue to unfold one thoughtful step at a time. The following week felt different from anything I had anticipated. There was a subtle electricity in the air at the office, a quiet hum of anticipation that I couldn't ignore. Each morning, as I walked past the familiar rows of desks and flickering fluorescent lights, I carried with me the awareness of our previous conversations and the experience at the gallery that had left me both unsettled and invigorated. One late afternoon, Mr. Anderson appeared at my desk again. There was no rush in his steps, no urgency in his tone, just the same calm, thoughtful presence that had marked our recent encounters. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his eyes catching mine in a way that made the rest of the office blur into background noise. "Of course," I said, standing. He led me once again to that quiet meeting room, now familiar but imbued with new significance. The hum of the heater, the faint patter of rain against the windows, and the subdued lighting created an atmosphere of reflection. Sitting across from him, I felt that same mixture of curiosity and emotional openness that had been building over the past weeks. "I thought we could do something different today," he began, his voice measured. "A little exercise in reflection and discovery." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of exercise?" "Think of it as a dialogue with yourself," he said. "We'll talk through questions, not about work or responsibilities, but about what drives you, what excites you, what you've been avoiding." I nodded slowly, feeling a flutter of anticipation. This wasn't about reports or deadlines, this was about uncovering parts of myself I had left untouched. He started gently, asking questions about my earliest dreams, my proudest accomplishments, my hidden regrets. At first, my answers were tentative, cautious. But as the conversation unfolded, the tension that had sat quietly in my chest began to loosen. He listened, truly listened, with a patience and focus that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. When he asked me what I feared most, I paused. Not the fear of failure, or of being judged, it was the fear of being invisible, of moving through life without truly living. "I think I've spent too long trying to fit into roles that were never really mine," I admitted. Safe, predictable roles. And I forgot what it felt like to take a risk, to trust my own instincts. He nodded, leaning back slightly, as if absorbing my words. "Many of us do," he said softly. We protect ourselves so carefully that we forget the thrill of discovery, the depth of feeling, the richness of truly engaging with life. There was a quiet intensity in the room, a shared understanding that transcended formalities. I realized then that this wasn't just a conversation, it was a rare human connection, grounded in mutual respect, vulnerability, and trust. For the next hour, we explored memories, aspirations, and even small, overlooked joys. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the soft scent of wet pavement and autumn leaves. The room felt alive with the resonance of honesty, a shared space where time seemed to stretch and contract with each word spoken. By the time our dialogue came to a natural pause, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. My thoughts were sharper, my emotions more attuned. I realized that Mr. Anderson's simple act of asking questions, of inviting reflection, had created a safe space for me to rediscover myself. As I stood to leave, he smiled gently. Remember, the journey isn't about finding instant answers. It's about being willing to look, to feel, and to consider what might be possible if you give yourself permission. Walking back to my desk, I felt the weight of the past weeks lift slightly. The office seemed warmer somehow, the light softer, the rhythm of routine less confining. I knew that this experience, these shared moments of reflection, would stay with me, influencing not only how I viewed my work, but how I viewed life itself. That evening, as I returned home, I sat by my window and watched the city lights glimmer through the early dusk. The memory of our conversations, the art gallery, and the quiet room with the hum of the heater all mingled in my mind. I felt a profound gratitude not only for the insight I had gained, but for the human connection that had guided me there. For the first time in years, I felt an unshakable sense of possibility. I understood that growth often begins with a question, with a subtle invitation to explore beyond the predictable, and with someone willing to walk alongside you. And in that realization, I knew something had shifted, permanently. A deeper awareness of myself, a renewed appreciation for curiosity, and an emotional connection built on respect and understanding that was the true gift of these weeks. Life would continue its routines, its challenges, and its small triumphs. But I had learned something invaluable. The courage to ask, to reflect, and to embrace the unexpected can transform not only how we see the world, but how we see ourselves.